Hi, it's Laura at Aquamarine18. Thanks for clicking on my video today. I am here to talk about the prompt for day 19 of 31 Days of Witchcraft, hosted by Heather Carter. As always, the link is in the description box below where you can check out all of the prompts. And if you click the tag, you'll find lots of other channels participating in the discussion. And today's prompt for day 19 is an interesting one, which is, how did you come to your personal path? And I feel like this is a very big question. And I actually just finished filming, so you'll see the same outfit, in day 28's video. I wanted to film these two together because day 28, we're going to be talking about the belief systems we were raised with and how they influence our personal practice now. And I feel like that question about belief systems we're raised with is kind of like a cousin to this question about how we came to our personal path. And I wanted to film them on the same day so that I wouldn't be overly repetitive. So hopefully I won't be overly repetitive. And so when we get to day 28, you will learn that I was raised in Catholicism and some of, how that has affected me. But I mentioned in that video that my reactions against Catholicism made me, into my early 20s, very much an atheist and very much critical of organized religion, critical of religious or spiritual ways of approaching the world as just not for me. So I chose to talk about in this video then for day 19, I thought that I would talk about why or how I came to be on a pagan path, on a pantheist path, as opposed to just a non-religious and atheist one, how that shift happened. And I don't have like a big, story about a lightning bolt moment or anything like that. It really wasn't anything, like that. I know, some folks who end up, on whatever kind of religious path they're on have this kind of moment, right? The lightning bolt moment. And I wouldn't say that I have. It was very much a gradual opening up to the idea of a spiritual path, to the idea of orienting myself towards the world in a way that included ideas of sacredness in it, we'll say. And so, without getting like too complicated or too much into it, I want to talk about why that for me was very much bound up with and intermingled with my immersing myself in and exploring postmodernism and post-structural philosophy. So this is something that I came to in undergrad, so age 18, 19, studying philosophy. My undergraduate degree, I have a minor in philosophy, so I took lots of philosophy courses, and it definitely wasn't like an emphasis at the time, which was in like the mid 2000s. It wasn't really an emphasis at the time in the department that I was in, postmodern or post-structural or even like continental philosophy at all. But it came to be very much my interest, and I took any of the courses, that I could find that were in those kinds of areas. Even if I didn't have the prerequisite, I, talked my way in if I could, because there was something about this that really interested me. So I thought, as a point of reference, I like having something to talk from. I would refer to this very important book, and I'll put the citation below. I don't anticipate anybody watching this video is going to go out and want to read this book, but to talk about this book by Jean-François Lyotard, The Postmodern Condition, A Report on Knowledge. And this is a book that I read when I was in second year undergrad, and you can tell that I read it in undergrad because this is embarrassing. I did this. Back in undergrad when everything someone was saying was important, so like the whole book is highlighted. I feel personally apologetic to Lyotard because of that. But, obviously I can't explain everything about this book or about postmodern philosophy, but there's a couple of quotes I think that I can talk from to situate how I came to my personal path and shifted away from a very much, science valorizing atheism to the pantheist pagan path that I have now. So something that Lyotard says in his introduction is that science has always been in conflict with narratives. Judged by the yardstick of science, the majority of them prove to be fables, right? So a lot of what Leo talks about in this book, and it was a book that I really struggled with at the time that I was reading it, is this idea that there's something called a meta-narrative, and he talks about postmodernism, as a philosophical orientation, as being about incredulity towards meta-narratives, so kind of skepticism towards meta-narratives. And here a meta-narrative is a kind of grand account, a narrative about knowledge and about narrative that seeks to kind of account for everything, right? A narrative that claims to account for everything. So this could include common examples of meta-narratives, could definitely include, certain religious accounts of the world that, everything in the world can be explained with reference to, the sacred texts, for example, everything from how we should live to how the world began, and so on and so on. Could definitely be something like that, but a meta-narrative doesn't need to be, a religious narrative. It could also be something like Marxism is a meta-narrative, right? Marxist philosophy has an account for everything. So could, some like Enlightenment philosophy, so could the narrative of scientific progress, right? The narrative of scientific progress, that everything is kind of along this linear, progressive continuum, and that the world is progressing, right? This is a meta-narrative about the world. And so Leo Tolkien is quite good at explaining how, the way that science and other kinds of narratives function differently, right? And so this is probably a real ramble, and I'm sorry, if nobody watches this, I won't even be slightly offended, right? So he states something that I think is important. He says, it is impossible to judge the existence or validity of narrative knowledge, which is a kind of non-scientific knowledge, right? Narrative knowledge could be any number of things. It's impossible to judge the existence or validity of narrative knowledge on the basis of scientific knowledge, and vice versa. The criteria are different. All we can do is gaze in wonderment at the diversity of discursive species, just as we do at the diversity of plants and animal species. So he says, there's different ways of knowing about the world. There's different ways of making meaning in the world, right? Of examining the world and accounting for it, right? And so here, science is one of those ways, but there are lots of other ways too. The problem, though, right, is that science often seeks for itself this ability to assess other narratives based on their truth and falsehood, right? Science is not in the same way content to just be one story about the world of many. It's the story. It has to be the story, right? It's the account. It's the objective, truthful account, right? And so Leotot says this is not true of other narratives, right? Other narratives will be tolerant towards scientific discourse. It approaches scientific discourse as a variant of the family of narrative cultures. But the opposite is not true. The scientist questions the validity of narrative statements and concludes that they are never subject to argumentation or proof. He then classifies them as belonging to a different mentality, such as savage, primitive, underdeveloped, backward, alienated, composed of opinions, customs, authority, prejudice, ignorance, ideology. Narratives are fables, myths, legends fit for women and children, right? So what he's getting at is that from a particular kind of scientific standpoint, science is the way that we learn about the world, and other ways of talking about the world are just myth. They're not, they can't be scientifically proven, so they're falsehoods, right? Or they're not truth claims. They're not truth claims about the world. It claims this kind of authoritativeness. Scientific discourse claims this kind of authoritativeness to assess all the other ways of thinking on its own terms, right? Science assesses other ways of thinking based on whether or not they accord with science. And so I'm thinking about this, right? And I'm learning about this. And my mind is just being blown as an undergrad. I'm like, wait. It's like science is a narrative, one among many. You mean it's not a yardstick we can measure everything else in the world by? What? And looking, it's funny for me to look back on this, right? But this is what I'm thinking, and I started to think that, this kind of atheistic, science-minded view that I had found myself holding actually shared quite a bit in common in some ways, and ways that came to make me feel very uncomfortable with the Catholicism that I had rejected, right? It had a reason for everything. It had an explanation for everything, right? It sought to assess everything and everyone in its own terms. And I didn't like that. So this idea of a kind of one objective truth, a one way of knowing the world, came to be something that fell away for me. And that experience, through reading these different philosophers and thinking, about my own systems of beliefs and that I had in relation to these kind of arguments, it was really like disorienting at first to think about, what if there isn't, one true account of the world? What if there are lots of accounts of the world that are meaningful? And maybe the ways that they're meaningful are different. And maybe that's fine, right? Maybe that's fine. Maybe that's something to celebrate, actually, right? Maybe there are other forms of knowledge that aren't scientific knowledge, but are knowledge, right? And whether they're comprehensible in the terms of science or not, that's not what determines their value or their validity, right? And for me, spiritual ways of thinking about the world, for example, might be these kinds of narratives about the world that science cannot account for, that science cannot, for me, assess, right? Because, again, the criteria are different, the terms are different. We can't assess the validity of, my spiritual or religious view of the world using the scientific method any more than I can assess, the complex terms of natural sciences from within the frame of reference of my spiritual beliefs, if that makes sense, right? They're different narratives with different criteria. And that's how I think about these things now. I hope that this makes sense. It probably doesn't. I promise when I teach about these ideas, I'm less off the cuff and, less rambly and more organized. But, so I experienced this shift, right? To thinking about knowledge as plural, to thinking about narratives plural about the world. And at the same time, I started to be, quite self-critical and critical of particular ways of looking at the world that came for me to feel cold, to feel overly rationalized, to feel desacralized. I've used that word before from philosophy, to feel disenchanted, right? Looking at the world with just a kind of scientific worldview as I understood it at the time, and so somehow, and again, I don't really no, there wasn't really a moment, where at one point for me there was, no sacredness, and then all of a sudden sacredness was everything and everywhere, right? From nowhere to everywhere. And that's why, to go back to a previous discussion, and I promise I'm going to end soon because this video, probably of all the videos I've made, is going to make the least sense. This shift is why, another reason why, the idea of magic and the world being magic is so important to me, right? Because I feel like for a long time in my reaction against, at least the variants of religion that I was raised with, I came to this place of just being very, dismissive of this kind of, that's some superstitious, ways of thinking that you just use to oppress women and queer people, and I don't have any time for it. And I came to this way of thinking then, though, that that there was no room for magic in, right? Because it was all just, objective truth and science and a very, naturalistic, I guess, way of looking at the world that I started to then shift away from. And so the world kind of became animated with magic for me in new ways. And I became more and more open to new ways of relating to the world, learning about the world, expressing my feelings about the world. And, if I had if ever there was a takeaway from having a philosophy degree, maybe this is the best kind of thing to take away, right? This total shift in how I thought about the world. And now I've landed on the pantheist pagan path that I'm on. So that's a very rambly account of how I went from being a definite atheist and definite believer of, science as the way to being much more open and much more interested in exploring and celebrating the many ways that exist to learn about and to know the world and to relate to the world in all of its magic, and becoming at the same time much more critical of, if not science full stop, then certainly, the idea of science as a be all and end all is one that I've shifted very, very far away from and have now, very, very, very strong criticisms of that to this pantheist way of thinking. I 15 years ago never would have imagined I would have ended up where I am. So that's my ramble. It probably wasn't very coherent. I'm keen to see how others approach this question, and I'll see you tomorrow with the next prompt. Have a great day, and I look forward to the next one.